The fluorescent lights in Millbrook Grocery hummed their monotonous tune as Marcus Walsh reached for a box of cornflakes on the top shelf. 6:30 on a Friday evening in late September 2023, the kind of quiet hour when working people grabbed last-minute groceries before heading home to whatever waited there. His 8-year-old daughter Ruby stood beside him, school backpack still slung over narrow shoulders, dark hair pulled into a ponytail that had come half undone during the day's activities at Millbrook Elementary. Her small hand tugged at his work shirt, the rough denim fabric that still carried the smell of pipe joints and thread sealant from the afternoon's jobs fixing Mrs. Patterson's perpetually problematic kitchen sink. The 82-year-old widow had been one of his first customers when he'd started the plumbing business 12 years ago, after leaving the Army Rangers and deciding that fixing broken pipes was preferable to the kind of work that had left him with scars, both visible and otherwise. "Can we get the kind with marshmallows instead, Daddy? The ones with the little colored shapes?" Marcus smiled down at her. The expression-softening features that his late wife Jennifer used to say looked carved from stone when he wasn't paying conscious attention to his face. 3 years since the accident that took Jennifer. 3 long years of learning to be both father and mother to a girl who deserved so much better than a widower still figuring out how to cook something besides spaghetti and scrambled eggs, still learning which braids worked for which school activities, still discovering that being present mattered more than being perfect. "Sure, Princess. Grab whichever box you want." Ruby stretched on tiptoes, her fingers barely reaching the colorful box on the middle shelf. Marcus watched her struggle for a moment. She hated being helped with things she thought she could do herself, a stubborn independence inherited directly from her mother, before she successfully pulled the box down with a triumphant grin that made his chest ache with love so fierce it sometimes scared him. The glass entrance door chimed its familiar bell tone, the sound that usually meant another tired shopper joining the evening crowd. Then the world shattered into chaos with the violence of a sledgehammer through plate glass. A man in a black ski mask burst through the entrance, cheap pistol waving erratically through the air in wide arcs that showed zero muzzle discipline, his voice cracking with adrenaline or fear or both as he shouted, "Everyone on the ground, right now! Nobody moves, nobody dies, I swear to God I'll shoot!" The transformation of the ordinary grocery store into a crime scene happened in the space between heartbeats. Milk cartons crashed from the dairy case where someone's elbow caught them during panicked descent to the floor. A baby started screaming 3 aisles over, that high, piercing wail that triggers every protective instinct evolution built into the human brain over millions of years of parents keeping offspring alive. Customers dropped to tile floors slick with years of accumulated grime and spilled products, arms covering heads in the universal gesture of submission and protection, some crying openly, most just frozen in that terrible moment when the ordinary world reveals its capacity for sudden violence, and everything you thought you knew about safety becomes a comfortable lie you'd been telling yourself. Marcus's hands remained perfectly steady on the cereal box, his steel blue eyes, the ones that had tracked Taliban fighters through Kandahar province night vision scopes during 2 deployments that taught him more about human nature than any philosophy class ever could, assessed the threat with automatic precision honed through hundreds of hours of combat training and dozens of actual firefights, where the difference between correct assessment and incorrect assessment was the difference between going home and going home in a flag-draped box. The ski mask had slipped slightly during the man's dramatic entrance, revealing a jawline barely old enough to need regular shaving, skin still carrying the smoothness of youth, not yet weathered by hard living. The weapon trembled in unpracticed hands that held it like an unfamiliar tool, rather than an extension of body and will. Finger positioned too far from the trigger guard to fire quickly. Stance too wide. Weight distribution all wrong for someone who'd ever actually fired a weapon under stress, not a shooter. Not someone who'd ever pointed a gun at another human being and meant it, and pulled the trigger and watched what bullets did to flesh and bone. Just desperate. Amateur. Dangerous in the way that panic and adrenaline make anyone dangerous with a weapon, but not the kind of professional threat that required the cold calculations Marcus's brain was already running through. Distance to target, available cover, angles of fire, Ruby's position relative to potential crossfire zones, probability of hitting the gunman before he could pivot and fire, acceptable risk levels given his daughter's proximity to the situation. He slowly raised one finger to his lips, looking directly at Ruby with the intensity that had always been able to communicate volumes without words between them. Her eyes went wide with sudden understanding, but she nodded once, small chin lifting with a kind of courage that simultaneously broke his heart and filled him with fierce pride that threatened to overwhelm the tactical calm he needed to maintain in this moment. They'd done the drills since she was 5 years old, practice scenarios she'd initially thought were games. If something bad happens, you listen to Daddy immediately. No questions, no delays. You do exactly what I say when I say it. She thought it was a weird quirk, another one of Daddy's rules like checking smoke detector batteries every month or keeping the emergency kit in the hall closet fully stocked. Now those drills might be the thing that saved her life. The gunman's sneakers squeaked against linoleum as he lurched toward the register where a teenage cashier named Kevin, Marcus recognized him from previous shopping trips, a kid who always offered to help carry bags to the car, fumbled with shaking hands at drawer mechanisms designed specifically to prevent exactly this scenario from succeeding quickly. The boy's name tag reflected the harsh overhead lights. 17, maybe 18 years old. Too young to die over a cash register that probably held less than $300 on a slow Friday evening when most people paid with cards anyway, when cash transactions had become increasingly rare, when the entire robbery probably wouldn't net enough money to make this risk remotely worthwhile. Marcus noticed her then, and the observation sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the immediate threat of the armed robbery. The woman in the tailored black suit standing near the produce section, 30 feet away from Marcus's position, positioned precisely where the checkout lanes met the store entrance, in a location that offered maximum tactical awareness of the entire space. She hadn't screamed when the gunman entered, hadn't dropped to the floor like every other customer in the store, stood utterly still with the kind of controlled awareness Marcus recognized from military briefings and combat situations, where staying calm meant staying alive, and panic meant death, where your ability to observe and process and react appropriately determined whether you saw tomorrow. Her posture read trained, professional, predatory, in a way that had nothing to do with the terrified customers cowering around her on the dirty floor. The kind of body language that came from years of practice moving through dangerous situations with your brain turned on instead of your emotions running the show. The kind of stillness that spoke of someone who'd been in bad situations before and knew how to handle themselves when violence erupted. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds across the chaos of the grocery store, and something passed between them. Recognition of a kind, though Marcus couldn't have explained what they were recognizing in each other. Professional to professional. Warrior to warrior. Whatever the connection was, it transcended the immediate situation. Just that she saw something in him that made her eyes narrow fractionally with assessment and calculation, and he saw something in her that made every instinct from his combat training start screaming warnings his conscious mind couldn't yet articulate into coherent words. Then her gaze flicked deliberately toward the gunman and back to Marcus, the movement so slight and controlled he might have imagined it, except he'd learned in Afghanistan that imagination doesn't keep you alive in situations where seconds matter, and the difference between correct assessment and incorrect assessment is the difference between survival and casualty, between mission success and catastrophic failure. She was communicating something, warning him, Directing him? Testing him? The gunman spun suddenly, weapon tracking across the store in a wild arc that made Marcus's tactical brain cringe at the fundamental lack of muzzle discipline. His breathing audible now, harsh, ragged gulps that spoke of someone on the edge of completely losing control of both the situation and himself. I said, don't move. You people deaf or stupid or what? Marcus had shifted perhaps 6 inches toward Ruby without consciously deciding to move. Old habits from Kandahar reasserting themselves with the inexorable force of muscle memory and survival instinct. In Afghanistan, he'd learned to place himself between threats and the things worth protecting, to position his body as the first and last line of defense, to accept that sometimes the only choice available was whose blood got spilled, and making absolutely certain it was yours instead of theirs. That you bought time and distance and safety for others with your own flesh, if that's what the situation required. He stepped forward instead of back, not rushing, not aggressive, just moving with the fluid inevitability of water flowing downhill, or a predator approaching prey it had already decided to take down. Not theatrical, not dramatic, just purposeful movement that carried weight and intention, the kind of advance that spoke volumes to anyone paying attention. The gunman's weapon swung toward him with the jerky panic of someone who'd lost control of the situation and knew it. And Marcus could see the precise moment when calculation met desperation in the eyes visible through the ski mask's ragged holes that had been cut with scissors or a knife, uneven and amateur. Marcus's voice emerged low and conversational, carrying none of the tension vibrating through the air like a plucked wire ready to snap, pitched to cut through panic and reach whatever rational thought still existed in the gunman's adrenaline-flooded brain. Son, you don't want to do this. Look at your hands. The gunman glanced down reflexively, unable to resist the command in Marcus's tone, the certainty that demanded compliance. His grip had gone white-knuckled on the pistol, knuckles blanched from pressure, but his finger remained nowhere near the trigger guard where it would need to be to actually fire the weapon. The gun shook like a leaf in high wind, trembling so badly that even if he tried to shoot from 8 feet away, he'd probably miss everything except maybe a ceiling tile. Walk away right now, before this gets complicated for everyone involved. Something in Marcus's eyes, some quality Jennifer at once described as looking through people instead of at them, like you're seeing what they'll look like dead and deciding whether you care, made the masked man take an involuntary step backward, survival instinct overriding whatever desperate plan had brought him to this grocery store with a gun and a mask. Whatever he saw there apparently convinced him that continuing this particular confrontation carried costs. His desperation hadn't prepared him to pay. Consequences that went far beyond whatever legal troubles awaited him if he surrendered now versus escalating further into violence. The gun lowered fractionally, just a few inches, but enough to show the decision had been made in the gunman's mind, even if his body hadn't fully processed it yet. Then he was moving, stumbling over displays of potato chips in his haste to reach the back exit, motor control compromised by adrenaline and fear, the door slamming behind him with a finality that left 37 people exhaling in ragged unison, the collective release of tension so palpable it was almost visible in the air. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second, their Doppler-shifted frequency changing as the police cruisers approached through Millbrook's quiet residential streets. Someone had managed to trigger the silent alarm or call 911 during the chaos, getting help en route. The immediate danger had passed, at least for now. The threat neutralized without shots fired or blood spilled. Except Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something else had just begun, that the robbery had been a catalyst for events already in motion rather than a random incident of street crime, that he'd just been maneuvered into position on a chessboard whose full dimensions he couldn't yet see. The woman in the black suit had moved during the chaos, and Marcus's tactical awareness noted with professional interest that she hadn't moved randomly or in panic like everyone else. She now stood blocking the front entrance with the same efficient positioning Marcus had noticed earlier, her body language suggesting someone conducting traffic control rather than someone who just survived a traumatic event. The gunman had been channeled toward the back exit as surely as sheep get herded through gates by a skilled border collie working a flock. Not by accident, not by coincidence, not by the random chaos of a panicked robbery. By design, by someone who understood how to position themselves to control the flow of human movement through a space, who knew exactly where to stand to make certain outcomes more likely than others. She approached while other customers were still processing survival, still clutching loved ones, or staring at nothing with the 1,000-yard shock that comes after adrenaline ebbs and leaves only the shakes behind. Still trying to reconcile the ordinary evening shopping trip with the sudden eruption of violence into their safe suburban lives. Up close, she looked mid-30s, platinum blonde hair pulled back in a chignon so precise it seemed architectural rather than decorative, like every strand had been individually positioned and secured according to some blueprint only she could see. Her suit cost more than Marcus made in 2 months of fixing pipes and replacing water heaters and unclogging drains, the kind of tailored perfection that spoke of money and power and access to things ordinary people never got close to. The gray eyes that studied him carried the kind of assessment generally reserved for livestock auctions or military fitness evaluations, cold and calculating and utterly devoid of the fear everyone else in the store was still processing and would probably process for days or weeks to come through bad dreams and hypervigilance. Her hand extended with manicured precision, the gesture so professionally calibrated it could have come from a corporate training video on how to make effective first impressions in high-stakes business situations. Rebecca Morrison, CEO, Blackstone Security Solutions. Marcus accepted the handshake, noting immediately the slight calluses on her palm that seemed completely inconsistent with the executive facade she presented. Women who spent their days in boardrooms and conference rooms, conducting meetings and negotiations, didn't develop calluses like that in the precise patterns his own hands carried. Women who trained with weapons and tactical equipment did. Women who practiced hand-to-hand combat did. Women who spent time doing the kind of physical work that wore skin down to tougher layers did. Marcus Walsh. You handled that situation like someone with professional training, military background, I'm guessing? The way you moved, the way you assessed and controlled the situation. That's not civilian instinct. That's learned behavior from someone who's been in similar situations before. He released her hand without answering the question, his combat instincts screaming warnings he couldn't yet articulate into specific threats, but knew better than to ignore. Around them, Detective Ray Martinez had arrived with the first wave of uniformed officers, a 40-something cop with tired eyes and the defeated posture of someone who'd seen too many grocery store robberies and convenience store holdups and gas station stick-ups to muster appropriate outrage anymore, who'd long since learned that most crime was depressingly stupid and banal, rather than criminal mastermind material. Marcus gave his statement in clipped sentences that revealed nothing about Afghanistan or the 11 men he'd killed there with rifles and knives, and once with his bare hands when ammunition ran out and the Taliban fighter came at him with a bayonet. Nothing about the nightmares that still woke him at 4 a.m., drenched in sweat and reaching for weapons that weren't beside his bed anymore because he'd locked them in the safe the day he brought Ruby home from the hospital 8 years ago. Rebecca Morrison listened to every word while pretending not to, standing close enough that her presence felt deliberate and calculated, positioned where she could hear everything Marcus told the detective without being obviously eavesdropping, her body language suggesting casual bystander, while her attention stayed laser-focused on the conversation. When Detective Martinez moved on to interview other witnesses and get their versions of events, she materialized at Marcus's elbow again with a kind of timing that suggested she'd been waiting for exactly this opening, that she positioned herself spatially and temporally to maximize the chance of this next interaction. I run a security consulting firm specializing in executive protection and threat assessment for high-value clients. We're always looking for people with natural tactical instincts and the ability to stay calm under pressure. She extended another business card, this one heavy stock with embossed lettering that caught the harsh fluorescent light, the kind of expensive cardstock that announced money and professionalism before you even read the words. If you ever consider a career change from residential plumbing, give me a call. The compensation package would be significantly better than what you're currently making. I can promise you that much. Marcus studied the card without touching it, his brain cataloging details automatically, even as he maintained the casual posture of someone only mildly interested. Blackstone Security Solutions. Portland office address in a high-rent district downtown where startups and tech companies clustered. Multiple phone numbers and email addresses. The kind of company that probably did executive protection and corporate espionage with equal efficiency, operating in the gray areas where money could buy services that weren't quite illegal, but weren't quite legal either, where wealthy clients paid premium prices for problems to disappear quietly. I appreciate the offer, but I'm happy fixing pipes and unclogging drains. Her smile never reached those assessing gray eyes. The expression as calculated and rehearsed as everything else about her presentation, like she'd practiced it in mirrors until it looked natural. Everyone says that until they see what we pay our field operatives. Just think about it. You have skills that are valuable in the private sector, Mr. Walsh. Skills that currently aren't being utilized to their full potential in residential plumbing. Skills that could command significantly higher compensation if properly deployed. Ruby had been waiting with admirable patience for an 8-year-old pressed against Marcus's side while adults conducted their incomprehensible business of statements and questions and business cards. But now she tugged at his hand with the insistence of someone who'd reached the absolute end of their capacity for standing still after traumatic events. Daddy, can we go home now? I have a math test tomorrow, and I need to study my multiplication tables. We haven't even had dinner yet. Rebecca's gaze dropped to Ruby for perhaps 3 seconds, and something flickered across her features too quickly for Marcus to read. Something that might have been pain, or longing, or recognition, or all three emotions mixed together into something complicated and raw. When she looked back at Marcus, the corporate mask had reassembled itself perfectly, not a crack visible in the professional facade. Single parent? The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy that made Marcus's spine stiffen defensively. He didn't ask how she'd guessed, though the calculation seemed obvious in retrospect. The wedding ring's absence, combined with Ruby's comfortable assumption of his complete attention and the easy intimacy between them, probably told the story well enough to someone trained in reading people and situations. Someone whose job involved assessing individuals and circumstances and making accurate predictions about behavior and capability. My wife died 3 years ago. Car accident on I-5 during a rainstorm. I'm sorry for your loss. The words emerged with mechanical sympathy, the kind people offered because social convention required it, rather than because they meant anything substantive or wanted to engage with the actual grief behind the statement. The kind of automatic response that acknowledged tragedy while maintaining comfortable distance from its reality. That must have been incredibly difficult, raising a daughter alone while dealing with your own trauma and grief. Ruby tugged harder, her patience officially exhausted after standing in a grocery store that smelled of spilled milk and fear for the better part of 40 minutes. Daddy, please. I'm tired and hungry and I want to go home. We're leaving now, Princess. Marcus pocketed the business card without further examination, keeping his free hand on Ruby's shoulder as they navigated toward the exit, past crime scene tape that hadn't existed 10 minutes earlier when they'd walked into the store, thinking about nothing more complicated than dinner and homework. His truck sat in the parking lot exactly where he'd left it, a battered Toyota that had seen better decades but kept running through stubborn determination and Marcus's weekend mechanical skills that translated surprisingly well from military vehicle maintenance to civilian automotive repair. In the rearview mirror, as they pulled away from the grocery store, he saw Rebecca Morrison standing beside her black BMW sedan, phone pressed to her ear, eyes tracking his vehicle with the focused intensity of a raptor marking prey from a high perch. The image stuck in his mind during the drive home, nagging at his instincts in ways he couldn't quite articulate, but couldn't quite dismiss either, triggering the same warning bells that had kept him alive through 2 combat deployments when other Rangers hadn't been as lucky or as skilled or as paranoid. Ruby's voice broke his concentration and pulled him back to the present moment, back to the immediate reality of fatherhood and Friday evening traffic. "Who is that lady, Daddy?" "Nobody important, sweetheart." "She seemed important. She had that look you get when you're paying really close attention to something." "Seemed isn't the same as being, Princess. Sometimes people want you to think they're important because it makes their job easier." Marcus checked the mirror again, but Rebecca Morrison had turned away from watching his departure, apparently finished with whatever surveillance she'd been conducting. "How about we get pizza tonight instead of cooking? You earned it for being brave back there." Ruby's face lit with the uncomplicated joy that 8-year-olds could still access, the world not yet having taught her that terror and pizza occupied separate mental compartments that weren't supposed to intersect. "With extra cheese?" "As much as they'll put on without the structural integrity of the entire pizza collapsing under its own weight." The drive home took 15 minutes through suburban streets lined with maple trees, showing the first touches of autumn colors, reds and golds creeping into the green as September surrendered to October's approach. Their house at 45 Maple Street looked identical to every other house on the block. White siding that needed repainting, blue shutters original to the 1970s construction, a small front yard Marcus mowed with decreasing regularity as other priorities consumed his available time and energy. Deliberately unremarkable, purposefully forgettable. The kind of camouflage that came naturally after Afghanistan taught him that standing out got people killed, and blending in kept you breathing. Inside the house still smelled faintly of vanilla candles, despite Jennifer having been dead 3 years, the scent having soaked into walls and furniture with the persistence of memory itself. Marcus had stopped lighting the candles after the funeral, unable to bear the association with loss and grief. But the smell lingered like a ghost that refused to move on or let him forget. Ruby dropped her backpack in the hallway with the casual disregard for property organization that characterized her age group, and immediately colonized the kitchen table with homework materials, while Marcus called in the pizza order and tried not to think about Rebecca Morrison's too convenient appearance at exactly the right grocery store at exactly the right time with exactly the right offer. Coincidences happened. Statistics guaranteed occasional improbable events where timing aligned in ways that seemed meaningful, but were really just random chance. Just the inevitable collision of independent probability streams. But Marcus had learned in Kandahar that assuming coincidence when patterns emerged was an excellent way to end up dead in an alley with a bullet in your brain. And the pattern here felt wrong in ways his conscious mind couldn't yet articulate, but his combat instincts were screaming about with increasing volume and urgency. Ruby looked up from multiplication tables with a kind of abrupt topic change only children could execute seamlessly, their brains making connections adults had learned to suppress as inappropriate or irrelevant. Daddy, why didn't that man scare you? Everyone else was really scared, but you just stood there like it was normal. Marcus considered his answer carefully while pulling mismatched plates from cabinets Jennifer had organized with labels he'd never gotten around to removing, even though seeing her handwriting still hurt like a fresh wound. How did you explain to an 8-year-old that some men carried violence like a scar, that fear became something you learned to operate through rather than surrender to? That after Kandahar, nothing short of immediate mortal danger really moved the needle on his internal threat assessment scale anymore? I was scared, sweetheart. But sometimes being scared means you have to be extra brave and not let the fear control what you do. Not entirely true. Marcus hadn't felt fear in the grocery store, just cold, tactical calculation and the familiar weight of decisions that might mean Ruby growing up without a father if he miscalculated angles or response times, or the gunman's willingness to actually pull the trigger. But 8-year-olds didn't need to know their fathers were broken in ways that prevented appropriate emotional responses to guns pointed at crowds. Ruby accepted the explanation with a nod and returned to her homework, apparently satisfied. The pizza arrived 20 minutes later, and they ate while watching nature documentaries that Ruby narrated with the kind of detailed expertise that came from absorbing information like a sponge. Bedtime followed its usual ritual: teeth brushed, pajamas on, hair combed out of the destroyed ponytail, a chapter from whatever book currently occupied her nightstand. Tonight it was something about a girl detective solving mysteries in her neighborhood through careful observation and logical deduction. Ruby identified strongly with protagonists who solved problems through thinking rather than waiting for adults to fix things. After she fell asleep, Marcus returned to the kitchen with Rebecca Morrison's business card and his laptop, the combination feeling ominous in ways he couldn't quite justify rationally, but trusted anyway because his instincts had kept him alive when logic would have gotten him killed. The website for Blackstone Security Solutions looked professional to the point of generic, sleek design that could have been any corporate site, stock photos of serious people in tactical gear, vague descriptions of services that could mean almost anything, testimonials from satisfied clients whose names were carefully redacted for privacy. Rebecca's bio listed Georgetown MBA and previous consulting experience with McKinsey & Company, the kind of blue-chip credentials that open doors in the corporate world. Awards and recognition from business organizations Marcus had never heard of, publications in security industry journals, speaking engagements at conferences, the kind of resume that seemed almost too perfect, like someone had crafted it specifically to withstand casual scrutiny while deflecting deeper investigation. He pulled his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 8 months. Mike Donovan answered on the third ring, with the gruff tone of someone interrupted during a baseball game, crowd noise audible in the background through what sounded like a decent home theater system. "Walsh, everything okay with you and the kid?" "Yeah, we're fine. Question for you. You know anything about a company called Blackstone Security Solutions?" A pause while Mike apparently muted his television, the crowd noise cutting off abruptly mid-cheer. "High-end outfit. Corporate protection, threat assessment. The occasional government contract nobody talks about in public because it's classified 6 ways from Sunday." "Why are you asking about them?" Marcus explained the grocery store incident and Rebecca Morrison's recruitment pitch, the words feeling inadequate to capture the strangeness of the entire interaction, the sense that he'd been tested or evaluated or positioned for something he didn't yet understand. Mike listened without interrupting, a skill developed through shared deployment time when staying quiet and listening carefully kept you alive, and talking too much got people killed. Rich folks only notice guys like us when they need something dirty done that their regular employees won't touch with a 10-foot pole. Stay away from that world, brother. Nothing there but trouble for men who work with their hands and still have something resembling a conscience. That's what I figured, but I wanted to confirm my instincts weren't off. Your instincts are solid as they ever were. They kept you breathing through 2 deployments when plenty of other guys came home in boxes. Mike's voice softened fractionally, the gruffness revealing concern underneath like bedrock showing through thin soil. You taking care of yourself? Actually sleeping or just staring at ceilings waiting for dawn like you used to? Some of both, if I'm being honest. That's better than all staring. Progress, even if it doesn't feel like it from inside your head. A beat of silence. Then Mike added quietly, "We're allowed to move on, you know. Jennifer would want that for you. She wouldn't want you spending the rest of your life stuck in neutral because she's gone." Marcus's throat tightened around words that wouldn't come, emotions he'd carefully locked away, threatening to leak through conversational cracks he hadn't meant to open. He settled for, "Thanks, Mike," and ended the call before the conversation could go deeper into territory he wasn't prepared to navigate tonight. Not with Rebecca Morrison's business card still sitting on his kitchen table like an unexploded ordnance waiting to detonate. Sleep proved elusive despite exhaustion that went bone deep. He lay in bed, staring at ceiling shadows cast by passing headlights, his brain refusing to shut down and let him rest, running through scenarios and possibilities and threat assessments until Ruby's alarm went off at 6:30 and morning routines mercifully interrupted the obsessive analysis that was getting him nowhere productive. Breakfast, packing lunches, school drop-off with Ruby chattering about the math test and whether she'd studied enough, work appointments that kept his hands busy even if his mind remained elsewhere, processing information in background threads while his body went through familiar motions of diagnosing leaks and replacing washers and explaining to homeowners why their DIY repairs had made things worse. Monday morning brought the comfortable routine of physical labor. Mrs. Patterson's kitchen sink had developed the kind of persistent leak that suggested root infiltration in the main line, a recurring problem in this neighborhood where mature trees and aging plumbing infrastructure intersected with predictable and expensive consequences. The 82-year-old widow supervised from a kitchen chair with the critical eye of someone who'd fired 3 plumbers before finding one competent enough to meet her exacting standards. Marcus laid out tools in precise rows on the drop cloth beneath the sink, each implement placed exactly where muscle memory could find it without conscious thought. Organization wasn't just about neatness or efficiency. It represented respect for craft, for the idea that work done properly carried inherent dignity, regardless of whether you wore expensive suits or work boots covered in mud and worse. Tools don't lie, Mrs. Patterson. They either work or they don't. Same with people, really. You can't fake competence with tools because they'll expose your incompetence immediately. She nodded as though he'd imparted profound wisdom rather than basic plumbing philosophy that any competent tradesman understood. The sink repair required replacing a section of corroded pipe and installing a cleanout access for future maintenance, work that took most of the morning and left Marcus's arms aching in ways that felt honest and earned, the kind of physical soreness that came from useful labor rather than pointless exercise. The black BMW pulled into Mrs. Patterson's driveway just before noon, its sleek lines and expensive paint job looking even more out of place in this modest neighborhood than Rebecca Morrison had looked at the grocery store. She emerged from the vehicle wearing another immaculate black pantsuit, despite September heat that had most people in shirt sleeves. Her appearance so perfectly maintained, it seemed almost aggressive, like a statement of control and power that refused to acknowledge something as trivial as weather or comfort. Mrs. Patterson peered through the window with unconcealed suspicion, her radar for trouble honed by 8 decades of life experience. "Who's this fancy lady? She sellin' something door to door?" Marcus wiped grease from his hands with a shop rag, his pulse accelerating fractionally despite conscious efforts to maintain the calm he'd cultivated over years of practice. "Business. I'll handle it, Mrs. Patterson. He met Rebecca on the front porch, keeping his body language neutral, but positioning himself where he could react if her visit carried threats instead of opportunities, where he maintained clear sight lines to both the street and the house interior, where he could move in any direction without obstacles slowing him down. Up close in daylight, without the chaos of the grocery store, her carefully maintained facade showed microscopic cracks, a tension around her eyes suggesting chronic sleep deprivation, a tightness in her jaw that spoke of grinding teeth during the night. Small tells that years of ranger training had taught him to recognize and interpret as signs of stress or deception, or both. Mr. Walsh, I hoped we could continue our discussion from Friday evening. Perhaps coffee this afternoon when you're finished with your current appointment? I told you I'm not interested in changing careers or taking on additional work beyond what I'm already doing. Her smile never wavered, but something desperate flickered behind those gray eyes for just a moment, before iron control reasserted itself and buried the vulnerability like a body in a shallow grave. Please, one conversation over coffee. There's more at stake than a simple job offer. I can assure you of that. The phrasing caught his attention because it implied stakes and consequences, games where outcomes mattered and people got hurt when moves went wrong. Marcus studied her face, looking for additional tells that might reveal what she wasn't saying beneath the words she chose to speak, finding nothing except that buried desperation quickly masked by professional polish. The morning brew, 2 o'clock, 30 minutes. Then I'm done with this conversation and you don't contact me again. Relief crossed her features before professionalism buried it like a body being covered with dirt. Thank you. You won't regret this, I promise. She drove away, leaving Marcus with questions that multiplied faster than answers could possibly arrive. Mrs. Patterson appeared at his elbow with the uncanny timing of someone who'd been eavesdropping through the open window, her expression mixing concern and curiosity in equal measures. That woman's looking for more than a plumber, Marcus Walsh. You be careful with her. She's got secrets written all over her face for anyone with eyes to see. Yes, ma'am. I'll be careful. The Morning Brew occupied a converted storefront in downtown Millbrook, the kind of independent coffee shop that served overpriced lattes to people who treated caffeine consumption like a lifestyle choice rather than a morning necessity. Rebecca had claimed a corner booth with clear sightlines to both entrances, positioning herself where she could watch arrivals without being surprised by anyone entering the space, where she maintained awareness of everyone present and every potential exit. The tactical awareness confirmed Marcus's growing suspicions about her background. She'd ordered black coffee for him without asking his preference, which meant she'd researched him beyond simple name recognition from the grocery store incident. The realization should have triggered alarm bells. Instead, it just added another data point to the growing collection suggesting Rebecca Morrison's interest ran deeper than casual recruitment for her security company. Interesting habit for a security consultant. Marcus slid into the booth, keeping his back to the wall from long paranoid practice that had kept him alive through 2 combat deployments. Always watching the exits and maintaining awareness of your surroundings. Occupational hazard when you work in personal security and threat assessment. She pushed a manila folder across the table between them, the motion smooth and practiced. I need to show you something that I think will change your perspective on my offer. The folder contained professional surveillance photographs, detailed biographical information, and home address documentation for a family Marcus didn't recognize. Judge Harrison Wellington, 58 years old, federal judge with chambers in Manhattan. Wife Patricia Wellington, 55. Daughter Emma Wellington, 12 years old. Son Noah Wellington, 10. Standard family portraits that could have come from any affluent household in America, except for the photocopied threatening letters included in the documentation. letters that made Marcus's combat instincts start screaming warnings. Marcus read 3 of the letters before closing the folder with more force than necessary, his jaw tight with the anger that came from seeing children used as leverage or targets. Professional surveillance work, detailed knowledge of family routines, schedules, and vulnerabilities, gleaned from weeks or months of careful observation, the kind of systematic stalking that preceded either kidnapping attempts or murder, depending on the stalker's ultimate objectives. This is a police matter, not something for private security consultants to handle. Police can't act until something actually happens. By then it might be too late to save the family. Rebecca's voice carried practiced control, but her fingers drummed against the table with nervous energy that belied the calm facade she presented. I need someone who can see vulnerabilities that trained security teams miss because they're too close to the situation or too invested in standard protocols. Someone with combat experience who understands how predators think and can anticipate their moves before they make them. There are thousands of veterans with combat experience living in this country. Why specifically target me for recruitment? She paused, choosing words with visible care, like someone navigating a verbal minefield where one wrong phrase could detonate everything. Because this case is personal to me in ways I can't fully explain right now, and I need someone who understands what it means to fight for family, to protect people who can't protect themselves. The phrasing felt calculated and designed to appeal to Marcus's specific circumstances as a single father raising a daughter alone. He pushed the folder back across the table, rejecting the implied manipulation. I fix pipes and unclog drains, not security problems. Find someone else for whatever game you're playing. Rebecca leaned forward, the mask slipping fractionally as genuine emotion broke through professional control. In 2018, Judge Wellington presided over a high-profile money laundering case, People versus Robert Harrison. Small-time bookkeeper caught up in something bigger than himself, swept into a federal prosecution that needed someone to take the fall. The prosecution needed a convenient scapegoat to close their case and make their conviction rate look good. Wellington made sure they got one. Marcus waited, saying nothing, letting silence do the work of interrogation the way he'd learned in ranger school when instructors taught them that suspects and witnesses both hated silence and would fill it with information if you just stayed quiet long enough. Robert Harrison died in federal prison in 2022, officially ruled a heart attack brought on by stress and poor health and the conditions of incarceration. He left behind 2 children who aged out of foster care, believing their father was a criminal who deserved everything that happened to him. Her voice dropped lower, intensity bleeding through professional control like blood seeping through bandages. I believe someone connected to that case is planning revenge against Wellington. Someone who's been watching his family for months, building detailed intelligence, preparing to act. And I believe innocent children will die if we don't stop them before they execute whatever plan they've developed. The story held together logically, but something about Rebecca's delivery felt rehearsed, like dialogue memorized for performance rather than truth organically remembered and shared. Marcus studied her face, looking for the tells that would reveal what she wasn't saying beneath the words she chose to speak. You seem to know a lot about this case, Miss Morrison. More than you should for a random security consultant who just happened to be present during a grocery store robbery. Her smile returned, perfect and meaningless as a corporate logo designed by committee. I make it my business to know about corruption in the justice system and threats against federal officials. $15,000 per week for 4 weeks of work. $60,000 total. That's college money for your daughter that you don't currently have. The number landed heavy enough to demand serious consideration, despite his better judgment screaming warnings. $60,000 represented more than half Marcus's annual income from residential plumbing work. Ruby's college fund currently held $4,200 in change, barely enough for a single semester at a state school. But money always came with obligations, and obligations came with risks. And Marcus had stopped taking unnecessary risks the day Jennifer's car hydroplaned on I-5 and turned his entire world into wreckage and grief. "I'll think about your offer and call you if I decide to pursue it further." He stood, dropped a $5 bill on the table for the coffee he'd barely touched, and left before Rebecca could layer additional pressure onto an offer that already carried more weight than surface appearances suggested. The afternoon's remaining appointments, a water heater replacement, a backed-up toilet that required augering the main line, a dripping faucet that the homeowner had ignored until it damaged subflooring, passed in the comfortable routine of physical labor and mechanical problems with logical solutions. But Rebecca Morrison's face kept intruding on concentration, those gray eyes carrying assessment and calculation, and something desperate she couldn't quite hide. The way she'd known things about him nobody should know from casual observation. The entire encounter feeling choreographed, like he'd been cast in a play without receiving the script or understanding his role in the larger production. That evening, after Ruby went to bed, Marcus sat on the back porch with his laptop and dove deeper into research that his instincts demanded, despite his conscious mind suggesting he should just walk away and forget the entire strange encounter. Rebecca Morrison's Georgetown MBA had no corresponding graduation records in publicly accessible alumni directories that should have captured that information. McKinsey employment during the claimed years showed no matches in professional networking databases that typically tracked consultants at major firms. The consulting awards and recognitions came from organizations that either didn't exist anymore or had been dissolved years earlier, with no clear explanation for their disappearance from the business landscape. Rebecca Morrison appeared fully formed in the digital record in 2018, with no meaningful footprint before that date, which was essentially impossible in the modern surveillance state, unless someone had worked very hard to erase history with resources and connections that suggested serious backing. The discovery sent ice down Marcus's spine, because you didn't erase history that thoroughly without compelling reasons. Either she was running from something dangerous enough to justify complete identity reconstruction, or she was running towards something worse. He pulled up documentation on the Robert Harrison case next, cross-referencing court records and news archives that Google had indexed. The details matched Rebecca's description: small-time bookkeeper swept up in major money laundering investigation, circumstantial evidence bolstered by witness testimony from co-conspirators seeking reduced sentences through cooperation agreements. Judge Wellington had presided over the trial. 20-year federal sentence. Robert Harrison dead after 4 years from documented heart failure. 2 children entered foster care system after their mother Margaret Harrison's suicide, 6 months following her husband's conviction, pills and vodka, and a note that said she couldn't live with the shame. The children's names were listed in public records associated with the case and the subsequent custody proceedings. Blake Harrison, 16 years old at time of father's conviction. Charlotte Harrison, 26 years old. Marcus stared at the screen for a long time, pieces clicking together with sickening clarity that made his stomach churn with implications he didn't want to acknowledge. He ran Charlotte Harrison through missing persons databases, finding what he already suspected he would find, but hoping somehow he was wrong. The photo that appeared showed a young woman with brown hair and haunted eyes that had seen too much suffering for someone so young. Reported missing from Portland foster care system, January 2019, 14 months after her father's conviction and 7 months after her mother's suicide. Last known clothing description: jeans and gray sweater. No leads or meaningful developments in the investigation. Case remained open, but effectively cold. One more missing person in a database containing hundreds of thousands. He compared the missing persons photo to professional photographs of Rebecca Morrison from the Blackstone Security website, looking for similarities beneath the obvious differences in styling and presentation. Different hair color and styling, different facial expression and body language, different everything on the surface that casual observers would see. But the bone structure matched perfectly once you looked past the superficial changes. The eyes matched, same shape, same spacing, same subtle asymmetry that suggested slight difference in eyelid folds. The left eyebrow had an identical minor irregularity, a small scar or genetic quirk that created a barely visible break in the hair pattern. Rebecca Morrison was Charlotte Harrison, which meant she wasn't protecting the Wellington family from an external threat. She was the threat, the person who'd been sending those letters and conducting that surveillance, planning revenge for 5 years while building an elaborate false identity that could withstand casual scrutiny and probably even moderately serious background checks. The realization should have prompted immediate action. Call Detective Martinez, report the deception, wash his hands of the entire situation, and get back to the simple life of fixing pipes and raising his daughter in peaceful anonymity. Instead, Marcus sat frozen on his porch, while implications cascaded through his mind like dominoes falling in elaborate patterns he couldn't quite see the full shape of yet. Charlotte Harrison had spent at least 5 years building a false identity from nothing, establishing a legitimate business with real clients and revenue, creating corporate credentials and a professional reputation that would withstand background checks from employers and clients. That kind of long-game planning suggested patience and resources and obsessive dedication far beyond typical revenge fantasy that faded when real life intervened. Most people who talked about revenge never actually did anything substantive. Charlotte had done everything, built a completely new identity, established credibility, positioned herself for whatever endgame she'd been planning. What did she want from Marcus? The question kept circling back, demanding answers he didn't have access to. She obviously didn't need help protecting Wellington from herself. That was theater, misdirection, a cover story to explain her presence and interest. She needed something else from him. Access to Wellington's security arrangements? Technical expertise for some aspect of her plan that required military training? A fall guy to take blame when her revenge reached its inevitable violent conclusion? Or, and this possibility seemed almost too paranoid, except Afghanistan had taught him that paranoia kept you breathing. Did she actually need someone to stop her? Was Rebecca Morrison's recruitment pitch an elaborate cry for help from Charlotte Harrison, a woman so deep in vengeance obsession that some buried part of her psyche, still capable of moral restraint, was trying to sabotage the whole operation by bringing in someone who might interfere? Marcus's phone rang, shattering speculation with harsh electronic reality. Caller ID showed unknown number. He answered anyway, some instinct suggesting this call mattered in ways he couldn't anticipate but needed to pay attention to. Rebecca's voice emerged, controlled and professional despite the late hour. I was hoping we could continue our discussion about the Wellington security situation. Perhaps dinner tomorrow evening? I know a quiet place where we could talk more freely about the sensitive details I couldn't share in a public coffee shop. I've got work tomorrow. Early start, full schedule of appointments. Then breakfast the following morning. Or lunch. Or literally whenever works for your schedule, Mr. Walsh. This is genuinely important and time-sensitive in ways I can't fully explain over an unsecured phone line. The urgency underlying her carefully controlled words confirmed Marcus's darkest suspicions. Charlotte Harrison was accelerating whatever timeline she'd been following for 5 years. Something had changed. Maybe Marcus's investigation had triggered alarms in whatever monitoring systems she'd established. Maybe external circumstances were forcing her hand. Maybe she was just reaching the breaking point where careful planning gave way to desperate action. Either way, the careful patience of 5 years' preparation appeared to be giving way to something more volatile and unpredictable. I need time to think about everything you've told me. I'll call you when I've made a decision about whether to get involved. He disconnected before she could apply more pressure or extract any commitment. Then immediately dialed Mike Donovan despite the late hour. Voicemail. Marcus left a message. Need you to run facial recognition on Rebecca Morrison, CEO of Blackstone Security Solutions. Something's not right with her, and I need confirmation of my suspicions before I make any decisions. Call me when you can. Sleep proved completely impossible, despite exhaustion that went bone deep and made his muscles ache. He lay in bed staring at ceiling shadows cast by passing headlights, mind churning through scenarios and implications and tactical considerations until Ruby's alarm went off at 6:30 and morning routines mercifully interrupted the obsessive analysis that was getting him nowhere productive. Breakfast. Packing lunches that would probably be traded or thrown away. School drop-off, with Ruby still chattering about the math test she'd aced and whether she could get a puppy for Christmas. Work appointments that kept his hands busy, even if his mind remained elsewhere. Processing information in background threads while his body went through familiar motions of replacing garbage disposals and snaking drains, and explaining to homeowners why ignoring small problems inevitably created bigger, more expensive problems. Mike called back at 10:15 while Marcus was replacing a garbage disposal for a retired couple who insisted on supervising every step of the installation process and asking questions about warranties and whether they should have chosen a different model. Rebecca Morrison doesn't exist in any meaningful way before 2018. No DMV records, no credit history before that date, no employment documentation, nothing. Complete blank slate, which is basically impossible in the modern surveillance state unless someone worked very hard with serious resources to create that outcome. But I got a facial recognition hit from the missing persons database. Charlotte Harrison, reported missing from Portland Foster Care System, January 2019. 94% match probability, which is as close to certainty as facial recognition algorithms get without identical twins in the equation. Marcus had expected the confirmation, but hearing it stated baldly by someone whose judgment he trusted still hit like cold water in the face. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate you running this down for me on short notice. Marcus, what exactly are you getting yourself into here? This woman built an entire fake identity with corporate backing and professional credentials that hold up under scrutiny. That takes serious resources and serious motivation and connections to people who can make digital footprints appear and disappear. None of which suggests you want involvement in whatever she's planning. I'm not in anything yet. Just trying to understand what she wants from me before I make any decisions about whether to engage or walk away completely. What she wants is probably illegal, immoral, or fatal to your continued existence. Maybe all three simultaneously. Walk away, brother. Some battles aren't worth fighting regardless of how compelling the cause seems on the surface. Good advice, sensible advice from someone who cared about Marcus's continued survival and Ruby's need for her only remaining parent. He thanked Mike again and disconnected, knowing even as he did so that he wasn't going to follow that guidance, because walking away meant Charlotte Harrison remained an active threat to the Wellington family. And whatever Marcus thought about corrupt judges or elaborate revenge fantasies built over years of obsession, kids like 12-year-old Emma Wellington and 10-year-old Noah Wellington didn't deserve to become collateral damage in someone else's war against their father. He called Rebecca back, and she answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting by the phone, like she'd been watching the screen and hoping to see his number appear. Mr. Walsh, have you reconsidered my offer? We need to talk, but not at a coffee shop or restaurant where conversations can be overheard by other patrons or staff. Mel's Diner in the old industrial district. 7 o'clock tonight, you know it? A pause that stretched long enough to carry meaning, long enough to suggest she was processing implications and calculating responses. Is something wrong with the previous arrangements we discussed? 7 o'clock tonight, Miss Morrison. Or should I call you Miss Harrison? The silence that followed carried weight enough to crush mountains into dust. When she finally spoke again, the professional facade had fractured completely, revealing something rawer and more desperate underneath the polished exterior. "How did you find out my real identity?" 7 o'clock. Come alone. We'll talk then about what happens next. Marcus ended the call and spent the rest of the day working through appointments on autopilot while his mind planned the confrontation ahead, thinking through angles and contingencies and ways the conversation could go sideways into violence if Charlotte Harrison felt cornered or desperate. Hemmel's Diner sat in a dying industrial area of Millbrook, a 24-hour operation serving truckers and night shift workers from the few remaining warehouses that hadn't been converted into trendy loft apartments or artist studios. 3 exits for tactical flexibility, clear sightlines through large windows that wrapped around 2 sides of the building, public enough to discourage violence, but private enough for difficult conversations about deception and revenge and dead fathers and the kind of justice that existed outside courtrooms and legal procedures. Mike would provide overwatch from across the street, despite protesting that this entire venture qualified firmly in the terrible idea category of decisions, the kind of thing that got people killed or arrested, or both. By 6:30, Marcus sat in a corner booth at Mel's with his back to the wall, watching both entrances while nursing coffee that tasted like battery acid and probably had similar chemical composition based on the way it burned going down and sat heavy in his stomach. Rebecca Morrison arrived at 7:05, her BMW conspicuous among the pickup trucks and aging sedans populating the parking lot like a diamond in a coal bin. She entered the diner wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her usual business armor, looking younger and infinitely more vulnerable without the professional camouflage she typically deployed like a shield against the world. She slid into the booth across from Marcus, eyes searching his face for reaction or judgment or some indication of his intentions, trying to read him the way he was reading her. "You've been investigating me, running background checks and facial recognition through databases that aren't supposed to be accessible to civilians. You've been lying to me from the first moment we met, constructing an elaborate fiction about protecting a family you're actually planning to destroy. Charlotte Harrison, daughter of Robert Harrison, convicted in 2018 on money laundering charges. Mother Margaret Harrison, suicide victim 6 months after her husband's conviction. Brother Blake Harrison, died in Afghanistan serving under a false identity after running away from foster care. You spent 5 years building Rebecca Morrison as a cover identity so you could get close to Judge Wellington and destroy his life the way he destroyed your family." The recitation of facts landed like physical blows, each one making her flinch slightly as though he'd struck her. Her shoulders sagged fractionally as years of careful deception crumbled in the space between heartbeats, the elaborate construction she'd built collapsing under the weight of exposure. "How much do you actually know about what happened to my family? Enough to understand why you want revenge. Not enough to understand why you tried to recruit me into whatever you're planning. What's my role in your elaborate scheme?" Charlotte, he couldn't think of her as Rebecca anymore now that the mask had been stripped away, met his gaze directly for the first time since sitting down, and he saw in her eyes the same kind of damage he recognized from his own mirror on bad mornings when sleep deprivation and PTSD made looking at his reflection feel like confronting a stranger. "I needed someone who could assess Wellington's security vulnerabilities from a tactical perspective. Someone with military training who could move through defensive perimeters without triggering alarms or raising suspicion. Someone who understood how to identify weak points in protection details and exploit them effectively." "You wanted me to help you kill him and make it look like an accident or random violence that couldn't be traced back to you." "No." The word emerged fierce and immediate, carrying conviction that felt genuine rather than calculated. Death would be too quick, too clean, too easy an escape for what he did to my family. I want to destroy him the way he destroyed my father. Systematically, publicly, making him watch as his reputation crumbles and his career ends, and his family looks at him with the same disgust and disappointment I felt when I believed the lies about my father being a criminal who deserved imprisonment. I want Judge Harrison Wellington to live with the consequences of what he did, rather than escaping through death. The raw hatred in her voice felt like standing too close to an open flame. Heat so intense it was almost physical against Marcus's skin. He recognized that particular species of pain because he'd carried something similar after Jennifer died, though his had eventually dulled to manageable ache rather than metastasizing into all-consuming obsession that defined every waking moment for years on end. And the Wellington children, Emma and Noah? What happens to them when their father's world collapses around him and they learn he's a criminal? When they go through exactly what you went through with your father? Charlotte's face went pale, blood draining from her features as the question hit vulnerabilities in her revenge fantasy she'd apparently never allowed herself to examine too closely. I never planned to hurt the children physically. I'm not a monster, despite what you might think after learning what I've done. I just needed to understand their routines and schedules, to identify times when Wellington would be vulnerable and isolated, when I could approach him or confront him or... Her phone rang, the sound cutting through explanation like a knife through silk. She glanced at the screen, and her expression shifted from defensive to terrified in the span of a heartbeat, color draining from her face in a rush. That's not possible. Nobody has this number except my attorney and my accountant. I was so careful about compartmentalizing everything. She answered with visible reluctance, listened for perhaps 5 seconds while her face went progressively more ash gray, then spoke in a voice that shook despite obvious efforts to control it. I don't know what you're talking about. I never threatened anyone. You've got the wrong person. Marcus could hear the male voice through the phone, even if he couldn't make out specific words. Angry, threatening, the kind of tone that promised violence if demands weren't met immediately. Charlotte disconnected with shaking hands, staring at the phone screen like it had just transformed into a venomous snake coiled to strike. Charlotte, what's wrong? Who is that on the phone? They have Ruby. They have your daughter. Her voice emerged hollow and shocked, barely above a whisper. The words didn't make sense, couldn't make sense, violated basic reality because Ruby was safe at Mrs. Patterson's house 3 miles away, being supervised by an 82-year-old widow who'd raised 4 children of her own and knew how to keep kids secure and out of trouble. Charlotte turned the phone screen so Marcus could see the photo displayed there, and his world narrowed to a single point of absolute focus. Ruby tied to a metal folding chair in what looked like an abandoned warehouse, industrial fixtures visible in the background, holding today's newspaper to prove the image was current and not archived from some previous incident, her face showing fear but remarkably no tears. His brave girl, his fighter, staying calm like he'd taught her. Below the image, a text message in block capitals designed for maximum impact. Pier 17, South Street, 9 p.m. tonight. Come alone. Bring Charlotte Harrison, or the girl dies. The world narrowed to that single point of focus. Everything else, Charlotte's deception, Wellington's corruption, his own conflicted feelings about involvement in any of this, becoming utterly irrelevant compared to Ruby's terrified face on a stranger's phone screen. Marcus's hands, which had remained steady through firefights and explosions, and the moment when Jennifer's hospital monitor flatlined and he realized his wife was actually gone forever, started shaking with barely controlled rage that threatened to overwhelm the tactical thinking he desperately needed to maintain. Who? The single word emerged flat and cold, carrying the promise of violence that needed only direction and permission to become kinetic reality. Who took my daughter? Charlotte's voice came out hollow and shocked, her own fear mixing with guilt and recognition of consequences. Frank Murphy and Joey Garcia. They were both part of the money laundering operation my father worked for, before Wellington threw him under the bus to protect the real players higher up the chain. They must think I'm going to expose them, along with Wellington, that I've collected evidence that implicates them in the larger conspiracy. How many people are we talking about in their organization? 3 at minimum, maybe 4 or 5, depending on how many resources they've pulled in. Murphy's a former NYPD detective who got fired for excessive force complaints, brutal but smart and tactically competent. Garcia's former Marine with dishonorable discharge for conduct violations, all muscle and intimidation tactics. They'll definitely have backup and weapons and a plan for how this confrontation is supposed to go. Marcus pulled his phone with hands that had stopped shaking as combat mode fully engaged and pushed everything else aside. Fear, rage, guilt, all the emotions that would interfere with clear thinking got locked away in boxes to be dealt with later, if he survived. He called Mike with 2 words that contained entire tactical situations. Ruby's been taken. Pier 17 at 9 p.m. I need immediate Overwatch support. Mike didn't ask questions or demand explanations, just responded with the immediate tactical clarity that came from shared combat experience, where you trusted your brothers to make correct assessments. I'll be there in position. 20 minutes to set up properly with equipment. Charlotte reached across the table toward Marcus's clenched fist, her hand stopping just short of actually touching him, hesitating as though contact might trigger violence. I swear on my father's grave I didn't plan this or anticipate this development. I never wanted your daughter involved in any aspect of my revenge. If I could undo what bringing you into this has caused, I would do it in a heartbeat without hesitation. Save your apologies and explanations for later if we both survive what's coming. Marcus stood abruptly, mind already shifting into full operational mode as the part of his brain that had kept him alive through 2 combat deployments took control from the part that wanted to collapse into terror about Ruby's safety. You're coming with me to Pier 17. If this is an elaborate trap and you're actually working with Murphy and Garcia, you'll die first before they touch Ruby again. If you're telling the truth about not being involved, then maybe you'll actually be useful in getting my daughter back alive. Either way, you don't get to stay safe and comfortable while my daughter's in danger because of your vendetta against Wellington. He walked out of the diner without waiting for her response, trusting that Charlotte Harrison had enough self-preservation instinct and residual conscience to follow rather than run. The drive to Pier 17 in Brooklyn would take 30 minutes through evening traffic that was already building as workers headed home from Manhattan offices. That gave him 30 minutes to plan the tactical approach, to prepare mentally for violence, to transform from Marcus Walsh, the plumber and father, into something else entirely. Something he'd hoped never to become again after Afghanistan, but that Ruby's kidnapping had made absolutely necessary. Some doors, once opened, couldn't be closed again, no matter how much you wanted to pretend otherwise. The warrior he'd buried under 12 years of civilian life was waking up, and God help anyone who got between him and his daughter. The sedan's headlights carved pale tunnels through October darkness as Marcus drove toward Pier 17, his hands steady on the wheel despite adrenaline flooding his system in waves. Charlotte sat rigid in the passenger seat, her CEO mask finally shattered beyond any possibility of repair. In the back seat, Mike Donovan methodically checked his rifle scope with the practiced movements of someone who'd done this exact preparation ritual hundreds of times in far worse circumstances than an abandoned Brooklyn pier. The silence pressed heavy between them, broken only by the occasional crackle of the police scanner Marcus had pulled from his emergency kit. Ruby's face filled Marcus's mind with perfect clarity. 8 years old, scared, but trying to be brave like he'd taught her. Tied to a chair by men who'd already proven they had no problem with murder or kidnapping children to achieve their objectives. Charlotte's phone buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced at the screen and her breath caught audibly. Another photo of Ruby, this one showing a clock on the warehouse wall behind her displaying 8:47 p.m. They had 13 minutes before the deadline Murphy had set. 13 minutes to get into position and prepare for what was coming. Traffic thinned as they crossed into the industrial waterfront district, where legitimate businesses had died slowly over 2 decades. The East River smell grew stronger with each block. Salt and diesel fuel and rotting wood pilings, the particular odor of maritime infrastructure left to decay. Mike's voice came through the earpiece they'd all donned. 2 blocks out from target location. I'm going to need 8 minutes to get into proper overwatch position where I can actually see what we're dealing with. Marcus pulled over next to a shuttered auto body shop. Mike grabbed his rifle case and tactical pack, moved with surprising speed despite the prosthetic leg. The shadows swallowed him within seconds. Charlotte stared at her hands resting in her lap. They trembled slightly. "My father used to take us fishing when Blake and I were young," she said suddenly, her voice hollow. "Blake was 12 the last time we went. I was 22, home from college for the summer." David would get up at 5 in the morning, make terrible coffee that tasted like motor oil, wake us before dawn while it was still dark outside. She turned to Marcus. "But once we got there, once the sun started coming up over the water and the world got quiet except for birds and water lapping against the boat, Blake would get quiet too. Peaceful. Like he'd finally found a place where he could just exist without having to perform or pretend or be anything except himself." Her voice cracked on the last words. "The last time was 2 months before Dad's arrest. Blake caught a bass that was bigger than his head, fought it for 10 minutes before Dad helped him reel it in, both of them laughing so hard they almost capsized the boat. Mom took pictures with her phone. I still have them saved on my old phone in a box somewhere. Sometimes I look at them, and I can't remember what Blake's laugh sounded like anymore. 5 years, and I've forgotten my own brother's laugh. Forgotten the sound that used to make everything seem okay, even when it wasn't." Marcus said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound hollow. He understood the weight of memories that turned into weapons you used against yourself. Mike's voice crackled through the earpiece. "In position on northeast rooftop adjacent to the warehouse. I count 4 distinct heat signatures inside the structure, 3 mobile, moving around, 1 stationary at center of the space. That'll be the girl. 2 more heat signatures outside conducting roving patrol pattern around the perimeter. 6 hostiles minimum, possibly more in vehicles or cold areas my thermal scope can't penetrate." Marcus checked his Glock with mechanical precision. Full magazine plus 1 round already chambered. 17 rounds total. 1 spare magazine in his jacket pocket. 34 bullets to get his daughter back from men who'd already murdered at least 3 people. Charlotte pulled a thin ballistic vest from under her jacket and strapped it on with practiced efficiency. She checked her backup pistol, compact Glock 43, that disappeared into her waistband. "Murphy will try to negotiate first before resorting to violence," she said, analytical voice returning. "He'll want to trade Ruby for the ledgers. He thinks I have physical copies hidden somewhere. He doesn't know everything's already digitized." "And when you can't produce physical ledgers?" "Then he'll hurt her to motivate me. Probably not seriously at first. Murphy's fundamentally a coward, which means he escalates in stages." Marcus's jaw tightened. How long before he moves past threats? 10 minutes of talking, maybe 15 if I can keep him engaged. They left the sedan and moved on foot through the warehouse maze. Marcus led the way with Charlotte following, both moving as quietly as possible. Mike's voice provided updates. Hold position. Guard just passed your location heading east. Give him 30 seconds to clear. They pressed against a wall covered in peeling paint. The guard passed 15 feet away. Marcus could have taken him in under 2 seconds, but noise traveled on water. They reached Pier 17's perimeter. The warehouse loomed ahead, 3 stories of corrugated metal and broken windows. Marcus studied the tactical situation. 2 entries visible, main loading dock, smaller service door south side. I'm going in through south door, Marcus said quietly. You walk in front. They expect you, so they'll focus attention there. Give me 3 minutes to position. Charlotte nodded. Mike, guard number 2 heading back. He's got radio. Marcus made a decision. He moved into shadows with fluid silence. The guard never saw him coming. Marcus's arm locked around throat. 4 seconds. Unconscious. He lowered the body behind container, zip-tied wrists and ankles, took his radio. The Motorola crackled. Baker to all units, status check in 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Timeline compressed. Marcus moved toward south entrance. The door hung slightly ajar. He eased it open with minimal sound. Mike whispered, Charlotte approaching main entrance. Murphy and Garcia coming out. Marcus navigated through warehouse maze. He spotted central area. Ruby sat tied to folding chair under bare bulb. The guard watching her looked barely 20. Marcus positioned himself behind rusted lathe 15 feet from Ruby. He could see Charlotte's silhouette. Murphy stepped into better light, 50-something, balding. Next to him stood Joey Garcia, muscle and aggressive posture. Where's Walsh? Coming. He wanted to make sure I came alone first. Murphy laughed, ugly, mirthless. Smart man. Smarter than your father. Charlotte stood utterly still. Let the girl go. I'll give you what you want. First, we're going to have a conversation about exactly what you know. Garcia pulled his gun. Boss wants to know how many copies of those ledgers exist. I told you I'd cooperate. Just let the child go. Murphy shook his head. Everything's connected. Justice has a price. He turned toward the interior. Bring the girl. That's when Marcus moved. The young guard never saw the attack. Marcus covered distance in 3 silent strides, blood choke cut carotid flow. 5 seconds. Unconscious. Marcus cut Ruby zip ties. He pressed finger to lips. Ruby nodded. He pulled back up Glock and pressed it into her hands, whispering, Safety's off. Hide behind those containers. Don't move until I come get you. She scurried into shadows. Murphy's voice. I said bring the girl, Joey. Silence. Joey? Baker? Somebody answer! Marcus keyed the stolen radio, letting it crackle with static. Murphy's body language changed. What the hell? Baker, report! Garcia turned toward interior, gun raised. Something's wrong. The loading dock exploded with noise. Headlights blazed as black SUV roared up. 4 men in tactical gear poured out. The leader, gray beard, cold eyes, swept the area with rifle. Frank Murphy, Joey Garcia, step away from the woman. Murphy's face went terrified. Who the hell are you? Judge Wellington sends his regards. We're here to clean up loose ends. Everything clicked. Wellington had been planning contingencies. Murphy and Garcia knew too much. Charlotte knew too much. Marcus had seen too much. Ruby had become witness. None were supposed to walk away alive. Murphy fired first, at Charlotte, pure panic. Shot went wide. Garcia fired at tactical team. Team returned fire. The warehouse became a maelstrom of violence. Marcus sprinted toward Ruby's container, Glock tracking threats. One tactical member spotted him, swung rifle around. Marcus fired twice, center mass. Man went down. Mike's voice. Multiple hostiles. Marcus, extract now. Murphy took around his shoulder, went down screaming. Garcia ran toward river. Marcus reached Ruby. She held Glock pointed at ground. Time to go, princess. Stay behind me. They were 10 feet from exit when Charlotte materialized, bleeding from Gray's wound. Loading docks blocked. Marcus processed. South exit into open where tactical team controlled perimeter. Can you swim? She stared. What? The river. Yes, but... Then we go through west wall into water. Mike, can you provide covering fire? Negative, but I can create distraction. Do it. Marcus led them toward river-facing wall. Old wooden planks covered loading chutes. He kicked through rotted planks. They splintered easily. Ruby's hand tightened. Daddy, I'm scared. He knelt. I know, baby. You're the bravest person I know. We're going to jump into water together. Can you do that? She nodded. I can do it. Mike's distraction arrived. Smoke grenade. Gray smoke billowed. Marcus grabbed Ruby tight. Big breath. They jumped. Water hit like frozen fist. Shock drove air from Marcus's lungs, but he held Ruby, kicking hard for surface. They broke through together. Ruby coughed but didn't scream. Charlotte hit water 3 seconds later. Jesus Christ, this is freezing! Swim. Marcus pointed toward pilings. Use pilings for cover. South to next pier. They swam through water tasting of oil and sewage. Every 30 feet brought another piling. Ruby shivered violently. Charlotte's teeth chattered. Next pier appeared. Concrete pier remained solid. Rusty ladder offered escape. Marcus hauled himself up first, then pulled Ruby. She came out shaking. Charlotte climbed with difficulty. October wind hit wet clothes and shivering intensified. Marcus wrapped his jacket around Ruby despite being just as cold. Mike. I lost visual. Status? South Pier. Cold. Need extraction. Copy. Parking garage, 3rd floor, 10 minutes. They reached the parking garage. Mike's sedan sat in northeast corner. He emerged holding emergency blankets. You all look like drowned rats. The blankets crinkled as they wrapped themselves. Mike produced change of clothes. Charlotte's arm wound needed attention. Mike worked with practiced efficiency. Mike handed out thermos, hot coffee. Ruby drank deeply. So, Mike said, what's the plan now? Marcus pulled Ruby close. We find somewhere safe for Ruby. Then we end this. Mike's phone buzzed. We've got company. Detective Martinez just texted. He's downstairs. Not alone. Marcus positioned himself to cover stairwell. Detective Ray Martinez emerged with hands visible. Behind him walked a woman in 30s wearing rumpled suit. Martinez surveyed their group. This is Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen. Sarah set laptop bag on car hood. Judge Wellington filed emergency injunctions trying to block investigation. There's federal task force forming to locate you three. They're being told you're armed and dangerous. Why are you helping us? Because 3 years ago, my sister was murdered. Shot by corrections officer who later committed suicide. That officer was James Walsh. They used your brother to eliminate her, Mr. Walsh. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Sarah pulled folder from bag. I need Charlotte Harrison's ledgers. With that, I can get warrants, start arrests. Charlotte looked at Marcus. Ruby spoke up. My daddy says the truth matters more than being safe. Is that true? Sarah knelt. Yes, it's true. Ruby looked at Marcus. Then we should help her. Marcus nodded. Charlotte pulled flash drive from pocket. This is everything my father documented. She handed drive to Sarah. Don't let him bury this. Sarah pocketed drive. Once it's in system, Wellington can't make it disappear. Martinez added, but you three need to disappear for 48 hours. I've arranged safe house in New Jersey. The drive took 40 minutes. Ruby slept the entire way. Safe house was a small ranch home in quiet neighborhood. Martinez made final check. Stay inside. Panic button in kitchen calls myself. After they left, Marcus carried Ruby to the bedroom. Charlotte found him in the doorway. I'm sorry. I never considered who might get hurt. Marcus didn't turn around. You didn't drag me anywhere. I made choices. But Ruby is my responsibility. Murphy and Garcia took her to get to both of us. She stood beside him. My father used to say, revenge is just grief with nowhere else to go. I thought destroying Wellington would fill the hole. But it doesn't. So what are you going to do? I don't know. 5 years have been about nothing except making Wellington pay. Marcus looked at her. You figure it out. One day at a time. Mike sat cleaning rifle. You two should sleep. I'll take first watch. Charlotte curled up on the couch. Marcus took recliner, mind too active despite exhaustion. Mike's voice. You did what you had to. Don't torture yourself. The words settled something in Marcus's chest. He'd done what was necessary. Ruby was alive. His phone buzzed. Evidence uploaded, warrants being drafted. Expect arrests by noon tomorrow. Tomorrow. 12 hours. Marcus settled deeper, let exhaustion pull him under. His last conscious thought was of Ruby saying, I believe you'll try. Sometimes, believing was enough.